Europe Group has notified the President of a decision relating to a change to appointments within the committees. The decision will be set out in the minutes of today's sitting and shall take effect on the date of this announcement. And we move on to the next item on the agenda is the report by Mr. López Aguilar and Mrs. Rodriguez Ramos, implementation of the Anti-Trafficking Directive. I should like to remind members that for all debates of this part session there will be no catch the eye procedure and no blue cards will be accepted. Furthermore, as during the last part sessions, remote interventions from Parliament's liaison offices in the Member States are foreseen. And now I would like to give the floor to the rapporteur, Mr. López Aguilar. S'il vous plaît. Por favor.
Gracias, señora presidenta.
Yes, thank you very much, President, Commissioner Johansson. Is there anybody in the European Parliament that doubts that that human trafficking and the trafficking of human beings is a criminal phenomenon of most serious consequence? Because it is. Objectively, if you take a look at the enormous scale of the business and the profits, the money that it moves, but it also is because it is a violation of fundamental rights and human rights, which are so sacred to European legislation and which are set out in the Charter of Fundamental Rights. And this is exactly what it explains. If you take a look at Directive 2011-36, this directive represents a decisive step in the work that the European Parliament was doing, and especially when the Charter of Fundamental Rights came into place, because we were looking at the way in which these kind of rights have to be protected, looking at the criminal law aspects as well. When it comes to fighting the trafficking of human beings, we're talking about a type of crime and criminality that crosses borders. It's on a massive scale. And the response has to be found at the transnational level as well, at the level of the European Union, and from this House as well. Within the Civil Liberties Committee and also from the Women's Committee, we have taken a look at this directive dating back to 2011, 10 years on, to take a look at how it's being implemented, a possible review to see how we can better tackle human trafficking. We had the strategy against organised crime and also the more recent legislation in 2020. If you take a look at the directive that is currently in force, it says that there have to be regular reviews every 2 years, so to 2016, 2018, 2020. But I think now we would have to say that we're faced with a kind of crime and criminality that has increased as a result of crisis situations and also on the internet, because we've seen that this kind of criminality has increased online, not only when it comes to increasing profits, but also to apply very cruel treatment to its victims, illegal adoption, organ trafficking, forced marriages, all sorts of different ways of exploiting the victims of trafficking. And this is why that what we want, what we're asking for from our committee is an age-adopted approach and also a gender-based approach, because the age of the victim and the gender of the victim are very important when it comes to exploitation, for example, in the sex industry, agriculture, building, or a domestic service. But the directive, 2011 directive, unfortunately, highlights a problem that is that of impunity, because it's very difficult to come up with evidence and proof, and then cross-border transnational cooperation between prosecutors, judges, the police, and also any other kind of legal officer. If you take a look at the Victims Directive, 2012, number 19, this stresses the fact that the European Parliament, when it comes to legislating in this area, should give greater protection to the victims of sexual and labour exploitation. Article 18 of the directive in the combating of human trafficking says that member states shall consider into their own criminal codes, the fact that one should criminalise the use, consumption or employment of labour and sex services of anybody who is enslaved. And if you take a look at what the member states are doing at the moment, it is very differentiated, and we need a more uniform approach, a more European approach, and we need some kind of response that's more effective. We are therefore asking for Article 18 to be reviewed so that all member states explicitly criminalise the use, employment, knowingly consuming the sexual services of victims of human trafficking. So when it says shall consider the inclusion in the criminal codes, it says should say shall include in the criminal codes explicit criminalisation of the use of labour and sex services of the people who are being trafficked, because it goes without saying. It's obvious that impunity can be seen in the very low number of cases that ever come to court and sentences as well. At the moment, if you take a look at the general sexual landscape of sexual exploitation of women, you can see that this very cruelly focuses on women who have been victims of human traffickers. And this is why it is absolutely essential that we move towards this amendment, this modification of Article 18 of the 2011 directive, criminalisation of those who knowingly use services of victims of trafficking. We want a multidisciplinary approach. So what we want is this amendment, this review of the directive. We also want to take a look at a residence permit and due support and aid to the victims. And I'll conclude on this point. We also want the member states to have the necessary resources and funds. There has to be cooperation with the civil society, and there has to be a link with the whole asylum procedure so that we can better protect the victims of the illegal migration routes, so that we can have a proper criminal law approach to these issues. Thank you.
Gracias. Next speaker, Señora Rodríguez Ramos, rapporteur, please.
Yes, thank you very much, President, Commissioner. The crime of human trafficking is a crime that infringes things like life, physical and mental integrity, health and human dignity. If you take a look at the kind of practices that are carried out which turn human beings into a good, threats, coercion, extortion, all of this aims at dehumanizing the individual and turning them into a good, a product. And the suffering that is caused to these people is enormous and everlasting. And this is why, in our report, we're trying to bring together all efforts and calling upon the Commission and all European agencies, all member states and civil society to fight against this absolutely abhorrent crime. 10 years on from the directive, this crime has just expanded and grown on our own territory. Half of the victims of trafficking are citizens of the European Union. And what's even worse is that a lot of these are children. We've just had a report from the United Nations in their department to fight drug trafficking. It says that there's an alarming increase in children who are victims of trafficking, and this has increased threefold around the world. If you take a look at poor countries and developing countries, there 50% of the victims are children. Vulnerability is the main characteristic of all these victims, poverty, discrimination, but gender-based discrimination and violence, gender-based violence, is also a main element of this trafficking. And this is why the main victims of trafficking are women, whether we're talking about labour market, labour exploitation, extraction of human organs. More than 60% of all trafficking, you can see that women are 92% of the victims. So this is gender-based crime. And 70% of the traffickers are men. So there's this aspect of vulnerability, and on the other hand, impunity. We're only able to free 1% of the victims, and we find it very difficult to arrest the traffickers, the leaders of these bands. And in the UN body to fight drug trafficking, this is the second main crime activity with the highest profits in the world. And we are impotent. What can we do? In this report, we're asking that we adopt a far more holistic approach and that we have a far more general approach when we talk about this crime. There are the agencies such as Europol, Eurojust, but then the agencies who fight against money laundering as well. Because if we really want to tackle these groups and mafia, we have to follow the money, traceability of money laundering. And this is what we have to do in order to attack their crimes. But there's another essential element of this crime, and that is those who use the services of people who are trafficked. And we have to categorize and criminalize the user, the consumer, because demand drives up the increase of the crime and increases profits. And this is why we are asking that all member states criminalize the use of and exploitation of trafficked victims. And finally, Commissioner, we really have to take a look at the victims, that we have to have an approach that's based on the human rights of victims. But the victims also need justice, and they don't get that. They need reintegration, they need reparation, they also need rehabilitation. And in order to be able to protect the victims, we have to be able to identify the victims. And here we're falling very, very short. For the children, for example, who get lost on these migration routes, minors, unaccompanied minors, we've been told that there are thousands of them who are invisible. So we're failing when it comes to an early identification of the victims. And this is why we really have to specialize, look at the specialization of agents and police and officers. So we need to count on civil society, on the NGOs that provide assistance and support to the victims. We have to guarantee the victims that they have assistance and social service mechanisms, that safe housing, a free representation, legal representation, psychological support. And once again, just to repeat myself, the victims are victims, and they can't be doubly victimized. They can't be doubly penalized again. What we have to do, we have to protect them. And finally, we've got COVID, and COVID is increasing vulnerability. So colleagues, just take a look around yourselves. The victims are in these textile workshops. They're in these adverts that you can find online. Because victims of sexual exploitation should not be hidden. They have to be advertised, obviously, don't they, so that they can be sold. Their services can be sold. They're there. So what we have to do is be brave enough to take a look at them. And if I could say, to quote a poet, sometimes the most difficult thing is to see what is evident and visible to everybody. So I think what we have to do is dare and take the courage to look at what is there in full sight.
Muchas gracias. And now I would like to invite Commissioner Mrs. Johansson. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Mrs. President, honourable members. Susan is a young woman from Nigeria. A woman called Ivy promised her a job in Europe. Instead, they gave Susan a short skirt and high heels. They told her, "You'll get used to it." But Susan never get used to it. Susan was afraid to escape, afraid to be sent back to Nigeria, afraid they would hurt her mother. But she did escape. And she testified. In the end, the judge sentenced this woman, Ivy, and put her in prison. This is a story of exploitation. It's a story of courage, but it's not a story of justice. Men moved Susan to Europe. Men guarded Susan. Men threatened Susan. When Susan ran away, men beat her mother. Men used Susan's body. And the men all got away. I know that trafficking is as shocking to you as it is to me. That you too want justice for the victims, that you too are determined to end the trafficking of human beings. So I would like to thank Juan Fernando López Aguilar and María Soraya Rodríguez Ramos and European Parliament for putting this report on the table. We must help the Susans of this world and step up the fight against trafficking in human beings. It's obvious that we need to do more. Trafficking in human beings is one of the worst forms of organised crime, carried out by cross-border gangs that exploit people, their labour and their bodies. Member States must fully implement the Anti-Trafficking Directive, and the Commission will assess this very closely. And we will help Member States by boosting capacity of law enforcement and judicial bodies, also across borders, perhaps with a knowledge hub to share best practices and information. At the same time, the Anti-Trafficking Directive will have its 10th anniversary this year. We need to start looking if it needs updating. And a full-time anti-trafficking coordinator will be appointed. The traffickers treat human beings as tradable objects, as commodities. We must disrupt the economic logic behind this crime. We must cut demand by targeting users. 60% of trafficking is for sexual exploitation, and 92% of these victims are women, like Susan. Without users, there would be no trafficking. I will look at possibilities to criminalise the use of exploited services. We need to make it more difficult to exploit victims' labour. We should target high-risk sectors like agriculture, care service or construction. Better awareness and communication campaigns in these sectors could help identify victims. We need to look at all the EU agencies that can help to tackle this problem. We must cut the supply of victims by breaking the criminal model of trafficking. To do that, we must end the culture of impunity. Human traffickers now make nearly €30 billion every year worldwide. I want to target asset recovery more effectively. To catch criminals and secure convictions, we need to boost law enforcement cooperation. That is already a Commission priority. Interoperability of data systems, updating the PRUM system. Our recent proposal to boost Europol's mandate will help to fight all cross-border crime, including trafficking. And we are working on a police cooperation code. To counter trafficking specifically, we could increase data exchange on trafficking through Europol. We could improve coordination between Member States and agencies. We must harness technology against trafficking. Europol and the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime are ringing the alarm bell. Traffickers are moving online. We need to improve digital capacities of law enforcement for online investigations to detect recruitment and trafficking of victims online and illegal money flows. We also need to work closer internationally. Working with friends and partners to fight smuggling is essential to our new pact on migration and asylum. Breaking criminal networks will also be part of our upcoming action plan against migrant smuggling. We should investigate if and how we can mobilise our foreign policy, security and trade instruments against trafficking. The traffickers aren't selling objects, they're exploiting human beings. We must protect the victims by supporting training of border guards, police, social workers and others to identify and save victims. Efforts by Member States to help victims with funding and sharing best practices, awareness raising on victims' rights, and by building partnerships, for example, with the Economic and Social Committee and Committee of the Regions. Throughout, we need to keep three things in mind. First, this is a European problem. 70% of the perpetrators are EU citizens. Half of the victims are EU citizens. 3/4 of trafficked children are EU citizens. This is a European problem. Second, this is a gendered crime. Nearly 3/4 of perpetrators are men. Nearly 3/4 of all victims are women and girls. Third, that the most vulnerable suffer most. Children, mostly girls, but many boys too, forced to beg and steal, but mostly forced into sexual exploitation. In migrants and refugees, traffickers prey on children and teenagers, on the road or in camps, especially unaccompanied minors, who are perhaps the most vulnerable of all. I look forward to work close together with you in the European Parliament to step up the fight against trafficking in human beings. Thank you.
Thank you very much.